I trust that the first two videos have been helpful to you and have introduced you to some important definitions and concepts in bassoon reed making. This video will be concentrating on observation and balancing, two very important things that the reed maker needs to be able to do. When you consider your bassoon reeds, you need to not only look at tuning and other aspects, but you should look at the balance of the reed, since this will optimize the reed playing both at loud and soft dynamics as well as throughout the range of the instrument. I have 4 principal methods of observation that I use, and I use to instruct my students. All of these methods require a wet reed, and they're really all quite simple. The only tool I need for these 4 methods is a bassoon reed plaque. The reason we use a wet reed is because the cane is suppler when wet, and it's also easier to view the layers of the parenchyma, that is the wood or grain, when the cane is moist. And we'll be able to observe some of that, and certainly in the 4th in this series, I've got some reeds that I'm putting before the camera so you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. One of the problems, obviously, with an unbalanced reed is that we have curvature of the blade in different places. This is an example where the top blade is stronger, forcing the lower blade to bend a little bit. And you can see even here the bottom portion of this blade pushes up the top blade in this position. Here's an example, the entire blade being curved a little bit. This one, it's just this one part of the blade. This is pretty well balanced over here. I have a little maxim or saying I use. Often my students won't know what to do to fix a reed. And I'll tell them, well, if you're in doubt, balance it out. And that's been a very good help for me and for my students as you are trying to figure out what will improve the reed. Usually if the reed is out of balance, just simply balancing it will be of a tremendous help. Besides the balancing, of course, some of the concepts and ideas I introduced a little earlier in the second video about counterpoises will also be very, very helpful. So let's go to the 4 methods of observation. The first method is to visually examine the reed blade, and you're going to be looking at the fibers or grain of the reed. You're examining the blade for symmetry, and this is an example where we can see grain fibers that extend further up on the left hand side of this particular reed than they do on the right hand side. Now actually, as you look at a reed, you'll see that there are fibers all throughout the reed blade. Some will suddenly appear, for instance, in this section. But we're looking at some of these longitudinal fibers that evidently started here at the back of the reed, and then we're into a different layer of the reed cane. So looking carefully at the fibers, at the texture, can show you where a reed is too heavy. And so that's a very important method of observation that I use a lot in my reed making. And again, it's easier to see the reed, easier to see those fibers and the blade if the reed is wet. The second method of observation I use is what I call the bubble test. The bubble test is done by positioning your fingers over the reed blade, looking at the tip, looking at the aperture of the reed directly, putting that directly in front of you, and slowly closing the reed with your thumb and index finger. And so what you'll get is sort of this bubble test. It will start, number 1, with next to no pressure from the fingers. As you close it a little further, you'll get number 2, and notice that the aperture, the center, the opening, the reed, this is what would allow the air into the reed, is closing up a little bit more here. These blades are in contact here, and then in number 3 we've even got a smaller aperture. Now this is an excellently balanced reed because the aperture closes and lines up right where the center is. If the bubble is off-center, for instance the bubble was positioned over here, it would mean that this side of the reed, the right-hand side of the reed, is stronger. The left hand collapses first, weaker blades on this side. The right hand has stronger portions of the blade, and that's left open. So that would immediately tell you that in order to balance this reed, you don't want to take off on the left-hand side. You want to concentrate your energies on the right-hand side, taking off cane in that portion. So eventually you can get the bubble to be aligned in the center, so there's a symmetry to these blades. The next step I use is what I call the finger test. Now, I know with the bubble I used my fingers. Yes, I know that. But this finger test is where I feel the entire blade. I feel with my fingers the tip area. I then feel the heart, both sides, left and right, feeling the alleys and areas near the rails. And I find with my fingers I'm able to sense or able to feel where there are heavier or lighter portions of the reed. And what I can't always see with my eyes, I can digitally feel with my fingertips. Our fingers are remarkably sensitive to pressure, and you might find that this is a quick assessment tool as well for you. The fourth measure of observation I use is to take the bassoon plaque and insert it in the reed so as to observe the rail thicknesses. For instance, we have the plaque here inserted in the reed. The blades of the reed are spread apart ever so slightly so that you can observe the thickness between the metal plaque inserted here and the reed blades. Now, this particular reed separated here is absolutely symmetrical. Some, however, will have one rail thicker. For instance, this lower rail might have been thicker than the upper rail. And in that case, that's another way for you to observe at the edge, oh, I need to take off some of that lower rail in order to balance my reed at the top. Last of all, I want to mention that we do have some reed measuring tools that are very helpful as well. I haven't mentioned these at this point. A lamp or a light source is a very nice method of measurement, and we'll show a video on that shortly. And also the dial indicator. Many people find it very helpful to look at reeds with a light source. This, for example, is that first reed I had, and yes, indeed, you can see some of the grains a little bit easier. One thing you need to be aware of, however, with looking with different light sources is that depending on the age of the reed and the density of the cane, the reeds can appear to look a little bit different. The denser the cane is, the more opaque the reed is. Those were, for instance, the two new reeds I'd shown you. And this is an older reed. It's a bit more opaque, a bit more difficult to see through. And this is probably the oldest reed of the bunch. And you can see how much darker that reed is than the others. But you might find that a useful way to use your observations and your skills at looking at reeds and the grain and things. A dial indicator is another way in which bassoonists can measure their reeds. The dial indicator provides different measurements along the reed. The advantage of the dial indicator obviously is it gives you some pretty exact measurements that you can work with. It's very good at measuring the center, spine, heart of the reed. It's not as good, however, with measurements on the rails or the sides, and that's one disadvantage with this particular type of measurement. What a blessing it's been that I've been able to communicate with you, to give you some information. And now let me... Amen.